been a busy week for me. Did a lot of traveling. Drove 400 miles since I was here last week, which is a lot for me. Probably not a lot for some of you. Lisa and I drove to Charlottesville to see a show, and then we went to a clergy conference for Tuesday and Wednesday. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that clergy conference and share with you in a very brief way what I think was important, what I found that connected and has parallel for our common life here. The presenter and speaker at our clergy conference was the Right Reverend Porter Taylor, the former Bishop of Western North Carolina. He resigned. Bishops don't retire, did you know that? They can't retire, they can only resign. And then their resignation has to be accepted by the entire House of Bishops before they're allowed to leave office. I'm sure that the House of Bishops is more eager for some than for others, but that's an aside. And another aside is the dramatic change that's going on in the House of Bishops. If you have not been aware, we have elected 3 African American women to the office of diocesan bishop in just the last 3 years, and these are the first 3 African American women to be elected bishops. The last 3 bishops' elections in the past 3 weeks have all been women. And so there is a change in the House of Bishops. I remember when Barbara Harris was first made Bishop Suffragan of Massachusetts, there were t-shirts going around, purple t-shirts that says a woman's place is in the house, and a little underneath it says of bishops. But anyway, Porter Taylor came and talked to us, and in his, after he has resigned, he's gone back to work. He came to the priesthood and then ultimately to be a bishop, the episcopacy, has a PhD in English literature and taught at both the high school and the college level before becoming a priest and ultimately a bishop. And he has since kind of returned to his roots. He's now at Wake Forest University where he's teaching, and he is helping to establish the Anglican Studies program at Wake Forest University. Doing some reading this week, I have noticed or recognized that in seminaries, the change of our multicultural environment is way ahead in seminaries of where we expect to be in 2040. And that's good news, I think, because these are people in seminary who, unlike me, are going to come out of seminary without the expectation of having a full-time job as clergy that will put bread on the table for everyone. We're going back to an earlier model of what it meant to be a committed person and leader, ordained leader in the Church of God, and that is to be bivocational. And I think there's some exciting things going on in that, and we have an opportunity to live into some of those things. And I want to talk briefly about the theme that Bishop Taylor spoke to us about. The theme of the retreat, of the conference, was my story, our story, and the story. And he admittedly said he borrowed these from Richard Rohr, again, someone who you probably should charge me money for mentioning in each sermon. It's like, please, not this guy again. I'm very fond of him personally, but I think he has great wisdom, especially for the church today. And Father Rohr says, and Bishop Taylor expanded upon, that he believes that human beings have really 3 domes of meaning that they operate in, and they all have to do with story. The first of them is my story. We start to tell our story, my individual story, and then it's important that we learn to tell that story, that we own the experiences of our lives, that we reflect upon who we are and where we have been. As I've mentioned to you before, I am a firm believer that experience alone doesn't teach us anything. Only experience that is articulated and reflected upon has a chance to teach us anything. In and of itself, experience teaches us nothing. If that was the case, if experience itself taught us anything, we would only make the same mistake once. How many of you have only made mistakes once and then just given up on them? I don't know, I beat my head against the wall way too many times. One of the things I found out is that it feels really good when you stop beating your head against the wall. Whereas one of my professors in culinary school said after one of my classmates cut himself, he says, it feels really good when the pain stops. And we might be in a place like that. Is that part of the approach of the church in our view of what we have been in the past, this Christendom model where we've had wide acceptance in society, we've had some time carved out for us, we have enjoyed a level of respect and deference that we don't enjoy today, that our response to that, rather than adapting to the times at hand, is to just try to do more of the same, but just do it harder, right? I mean, you remember Einstein or whoever it was, their definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That's one of the things that I think that we are poised to do something about. So the next move out of this my story is into our story, and that's what communities are about, that we have a collective story to tell as a group, as a club. Part of the sense of the expansion and explosion of the church that oftentimes we want to go back to, this post-World War II model, the 1950s and 60s when nothing was open on Sunday and everybody came to church. First of all, it's not true. I mean, maybe everything was closed on Sunday, but not everybody was in church. I think if we looked at the tee times at golf courses and the attendance at tennis clubs, they didn't suffer any on Sunday mornings. I would guess that Kingsmill did a brisk business in the 1950s and 60s as well as it does today on Sundays. But the perception was that we had more to do because there were fewer options. And that there were fewer options was important because it's where people went to make connections that we have learned to make in different ways now. We did a lot of service and social clubs in those days, and the church fit in that in some ways. And it enjoyed not having to define and tell its own story very well. And we got to be fairly insular. And we started to recognize in the 1960s when prophets like Dr. King continually and rightfully called 11 o'clock on the Sunday morning the most segregated hour in America. That's not our story. And the next thing that we as humans do or are called to do by virtue of our system of belief, our cosmology that says that the Lord God is king over all, that as Revelation tells us a new heaven and a new earth is on its way, is that we can hold up our heads, like the psalm said. We are not being defeated. We may be dwindling in numbers, but it seems to me that smaller numbers have always been the places where God has worked most powerfully. Jesus chose only 12, or only 12 chose to follow Jesus from the beginning. A remnant of the Israelites moved across the Sinai, and a number of them died, and yet they were unable to inhabit the promised land. After exile in Persia and in Babylon, it was a faithful remnant that came back to Jerusalem to rebuild. It's not everybody that we need. It is the God's people who are most committed to God's work in the world, to living into the story that God is calling us to do. Bishop Taylor also went on to say that the natural tendency of communities, of people, when they are under attack, is to start to revert. That when we're living into our story and we feel threatened, we retreat. Or when we're living into the story, we start to retreat into just our story. And there is truth that we need to be aware of the needs of those who are members of the congregation and to provide pastoral care in ways that we have not been so good at. And I own my part of that. But we can't give up our proclamation of the story, because that is the sum and substance of who we are as the evangel, the bearers of the good news. It is easy for us in times of contraction, in both budget and in people, to just say, forget it. I'm just going to deal with my story. I'm going to retreat from our story into my story. and I'll stay home and watch Mass on whatever TV show, and we'll call it good. I'll just be spiritual, I won't be religious. It's possible to be spiritual and not religious, but I don't believe that it's possible to be a Christian without being religious, because we are, as Bishop Porter Taylor reminded us, we are in the communion business, and it's what the world is seeking. It's what the thirst and the hunger of people is. He said that in his time in retirement, he seems to have found much less anxiety about the institution. And he said that may seem obvious on one level because he didn't have to deal with all the acting out that clergy do. He said that was the most sapping part of his job, that those of us we ought to know better. He said, I felt like I just wanted to shake them when they would mess up, when they would act out, when they would break their vows. And then he would remember, but these are human beings as well, and facing pressures that are internal and external as well. What he said, and he said with passion, and he said repeatedly, he said, I have no interest in propping up the institution. The church, and read that as the people of God, is in the communion business. We are here not to introduce people to the Episcopal Church, but to introduce people to Jesus. It is the vital spiritual experience that has a great deal to tell us. He showed us a graphic that said, it was the Pew Center for Religious Studies in America. And it's a question that was asked over the decades. It was asked in 1962, it was asked in 1982, it was asked again in 2002. How many of you have had a mystical experience? And that mystical experience it was defined as a direct experience of the living God. In 1962, at the time when we're talking about the church was at its fullest, when everything was great in the church. Wasn't everything great in the church in 1962? No, it wasn't. There's never been a time when everything has been great. In 1962, 24% of Americans said that they had had a mystical experience. In 1982, that number went up to 34%. Anybody want to guess what the number was in 2002? 46% of Americans claim to have had a mystical experience. I've said this one to you before, and I will say it again, that I think we need to be at least as tuned in to the spiritual hunger of people as we are to our own desire to fill the pews and to prop up the institution or the building. At the end of the day, as Bishop Taylor said, God's going to do what God's going to do, whether the Episcopal Church survives as we know it or not. And that our very story, the story, actually says, and Jesus says it over and over again, that if a grain of wheat is to produce, it must first do what? The defining event of Christianity is what? The resurrection. Can you think about what Lazarus had to go through today? Poor sap had to die twice. Right? I don't envy Lazarus being raised from the dead in that way. What I want to understand is that I can live my life in a full state, recognizing that God is with me without having to go to all these lengths of 4 days in the tomb, that I can live the fullest life available to me in God now because of communion. Bishop Taylor said, I could really care less about preaching now. He said, I just need to go somewhere where I can get God in me. I need the bread. I need the wine. I need people around me who understand that we must take into us what we desire to be. That's part of what I say to you every week at the Words of Institution, the words of Augustine, behold who you are, become what you receive. Become the body and the blood of Jesus at work in this world, and we won't have to worry about the church. Don't you probably don't already, but don't worry about my pension. Okay? Don't even worry so much about my salary. And I beg you, open your mind to the possibility that not worrying about the building could free up immense imagination and resources for the work of ministry, for the needs of the 46% of people who report having a mystical experience and have no community of faith in which to discuss or unpack that experience. We need very little to be the church, except to give up all that we have and all that we are for the sake of the gospel. The poet, the mystical Sufi poet, Rumi, said it something like this. The traveler asked, "What is the cost of love?" The sage said, "The cost of loving is your life." The traveler said, "What a bargain."